Tonight on Nation to Nation, the Indigenous rights framework was supposed to be dead, and yet the Trudeau government is rolling out smaller deals with First Nations. Is it succeeding?
The Prime Minister has failed in terms of standing up in the House a little over a year ago now, making a big commitment, and he's not getting it done.
The Prime Minister may be making deals with First Nations, but a different deal refuses to go away, and the NDP say it shows where his priorities are.
To have this government step up and buy this pipeline for billions of dollars without any sort of discussion with anyone, it just shows when it comes to priorities, Indigenous communities are not the priorities.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran and welcome to Nation. After a long Christmas break, the House is sitting once again. That means we have our political panel back and we have a lot to talk about. First up is Prime Minister Trudeau's Indigenous rights framework. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett called it a code that would restrict Ottawa from infringing on Indigenous rights in the future. Legislation was supposed to be tabled before Christmas, but that never happened. Several First Nations said the engagement process was happening too fast. But there's been a series of announcements earlier this month suggesting the Trudeau government is maybe quietly rolling it out. Here to talk about it is Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller. Welcome. The Conservative Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Cathy McLeod, and NDP MP Rachel Blaney. All welcome to Nation. Now, Mr. Miller, I got here just one of the announcements, and this was back in January between Crown Indigenous Relations and the Mi'kmaq. And you talked about working with the Mi'kmaq towards a government-government relationship based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, partnership. Doesn't that kind of sound like that you're trying to do the rights framework piecemeal now?
Well, what that says is what's contained in Section 35 of the Constitution. What we heard resoundingly from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis is take the time to do it right and listen to us. The MOUs that you're referencing in large part for a long time have been in the works for a long time. So they predate, and to a large extent, any pronouncements by the Prime Minister or the Minister of Indigenous Crown Relations. What we heard through the engagement sessions, which we'll continue to do, is yes, take the time to do it right, but that there are different needs in different communities, and so these MOUs are a very small step forward in our relationship, but something that we're going to take the time to do and do properly.
Are these MOUs, I suppose somebody could say that they look like you're doing it piecemeal instead of doing something that it would be hard to get consensus on anyway, which is a broad piece of legislation?
Well, what we heard resoundingly, as I mentioned, is that one size fits all just doesn't work, and especially when it comes just from one side. A lot of these MOUs are first steps forward. Some of them are sectoral, whether you're talking about education or acknowledgement of fishing rights, to a large extent inherent rights. And so they are positive. If you talk to the community leaders that are eager to sign them, they do represent a change in tone, a change in attitude, and a change in the legal relationship. And you have other nations that are lining up to get into that discussion. They won't always be positive or one-sided, but they are a reflection of a relationship and a dialogue, which is so needed in this country.
Ms. McLeod, as we heard, a lot of First Nations were against the approach taken by the government before. I don't know, do you think this is the way to go, though? Is this piecemeal fashion?
So what I'm hearing is people that are concerned on the ground, the people in the communities are concerned about drinking water, they're concerned about housing, they're concerned about lots of issues, and quite frankly, this work is not touching their lives at all. I was fully expecting, we had a big press conference in December with the Indigenous leaderships and the minister, and they talked about child welfare legislation. Was it tabled yesterday? Was it tabled today? Do they have any intention of moving something that important through, or is it just going to be something they want to put into the window for the next election? I talked to the minister yesterday and I said, listen, we really want to see this child welfare legislation. Hopefully you haven't botched it like you did with the gender equity, the S3. If you botched it, we'll do our job and we're going to hold you to account, but we want to see those sorts of things moving forward because they're important. So, great that MOUs that might move things forward in a positive direction, but clearly the Prime Minister has failed in terms of standing up in the House a little over a year ago now, making a big commitment, and he's not getting it done.
Ms. Blaney, from what you heard, is that the framework agreement initiative is the kind of, do you think it's worth pursuing, especially before the next election?
Well, first of all, I would like to point out that we did have a bill go through the House of Commons that was supported by the Liberals, Bill C-262, which is really about looking at the framework of Canada and our legislation and making sure that it meets the criteria of the United Nations Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I think we have to step back a moment and maybe ask the government to start doing those sort of promises first. You know, we've heard so many times that there's a lack of consultation. When consultation happens, all too often, it's note takers coming to get information. It's not a place at the table in a meaningful way. There's a lot of meaningful action that needs to happen. I have heard from my communities about trying to set up more economic development, but at the same time having to deal with high rates of suicide in their communities, having to deal with issues like lack of clean drinking water, being on diesel fuel, and the cost, the enormous cost to those communities to make that work. So there's a lot of gaps that aren't being dealt with, and now we're seeing, you know, a promise and then a rejection from Indigenous communities. It just shows that this government is not following through on its promise to have a respectful dialogue, and waiting till now, right before the next election, to start having this discussion in a meaningful, comprehensive way. It does look like it's something that's going to be sitting in the window front. How many years do Indigenous communities have to wait? They've waited far too long. Let's see some action.
It sounds like what you're saying is we should let Indigenous services get some work done before Crown Indigenous Relations pushes through this type of legislation.
I think what I'm trying to say is the process of actually consulting, I should say, with Indigenous communities has to be a priority. And there are too many times that we've seen in the last 4 years and previously as well with former governments that that process was not done in a respectful way. When we have legislation like the C-262 that really says, how are we going to look at legislation and make sure that it works seamlessly with the rights of Indigenous people? You know, that's somewhere to start, and I think it's totally a lost moment for this government to not take that and work with it.
Ms. McLeod, there was a big announcement about education last week, a couple of announcements. Again, is this kind of the approach that is being done? It's not done, of course, your Conservative government introduced legislation that never got through. It sounds like, again, it's a piecemeal way to get to reform in education rather than doing an overarching piece of legislation. Is that the way we have to go?
So, first of all, education, we do support education, proper investment in education. What I liked was when we had the Anishinaabe Education Act, because then what you had was the necessary partnerships, the necessary standards, the necessary transparency built in to the agreement. So I think, I'm not sure what they're building into this education agreement. It doesn't sound like they're building in the sort of proper structures and mechanisms to make it be successful. So I think, really Indigenous language is absolutely important to support, but have they built in the mechanisms that they need to, like we did with the First Nations education in British Columbia with the Anishinaabe, or is this just sort of the government heading out and saying, oh, we're trying to look good as opposed to doing the work that needs to be done?
Mr. Miller, I know education is Indigenous services, but again, are you trying to get something put forward without doing, legislation that could go to a committee to be examined?
Well, let me talk a second about education as a core element of identity. We know the damage that has been done by residential schools and Indigenous control over education. It secures that key element of identity, and the proof is clear when you have Indigenous control over education. The graduation levels are equal, if not better, to non-Indigenous graduation levels, and this is, you see that in our experience with the Mi'kmaq control over their education system, and I was there at the announcement for the Anishinaabe agreement, and you say these things are not felt in community. This is quite the contrary. People are overjoyed to have control over their children, which hasn't been secured in the past, and the ability to teach culture, language as a core element of education, a core element of identity, and not something that you do at 5 o'clock on a Friday. So these are real changes. Sometimes you need legislation, as in the case that I mentioned, but sometimes you don't. When we're talking about funding, when we're talking about getting money and closing that education gap that exists between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples, we can do that, and we can move in an effective fashion that gives secure and predictable funding into communities, because we know that the results are at the table when you do have that level of control over the education system. So this is something that we need to continue talking about and continuing pushing as a government, and ensuring that the successive governments, hopefully ours obviously, but any government that's empowered, because reconciliation is more than simply the Prime Minister or any particular minister or any particular leader in a community. It is something that all Canadians need to be a part of.
So just a quick, with the money flowing to communities, again, what they've neglected to do is build in transparency mechanisms so communities can hold their leadership, their systems to account. So when you had legislation, again, with the one agreement we're talking about, or the First Nations in British Columbia, but what they're doing, and transparency and accountability is to be for the communities, and they haven't created the structures that are going to allow communities to, call their leadership to account in terms of what they're doing and how they're doing it, whether, it's around language. I mean, we saw what happened with the hot lunch program. The parents maybe didn't even know there was a hot lunch program that was being funded. They need to be able to look at and have some transparency and accountability.
Of course, that legislation is still on the books. The Liberal government just isn't enforcing it. Is that something you might bring back as a Conservative government?
Absolutely. And it's about community members having the ability to hold their leadership to account. So whether it's municipal, provincial, federal governments, people can go online, they can see what Kathy McLeod's expenses are, what Rachel's, what Mark's are. First Nations communities need that. You look at Charmaine Stick and that difficult process that she went through to even understand what her community, how they were spending the money that was there for them.
Okay, well, we could talk more about it, but I want to get to another topic. So we'll have a short break, and after the break, we'll get the MP's take on the continuing battle over resource development. Welcome back. Last week, the government of British Columbia and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation gave their final submissions to the National Energy Board. They, of course, opposed the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. And of course, earlier this month, another pipeline project made news when 14 people were arrested in northern BC. With opposition there, an ongoing concern. The federal Conservative opposition often criticized the Trudeau government for not building 1 centimetre of pipeline. Once again, our political panel weighs in. And Ms. McLeod, I'm going to start with you. You went on a Trans Mountain Pipeline tour from all the way from Alberta right to the coast. What was the purpose of that?
So I think often in the media what we are hearing is the negative stories, the people that are do not want the pipeline to proceed. And so what my purpose was is to talk about the positive stories, whether it First Nations or whether it be communities, whether it be workers, that really the pipeline can be an opportunity for all Canadians. But more importantly, it was in terms of protecting the fish. If you've never traveled through British Columbia, you see trains that are increasing with oil being transported in tanker cars. It is along some of the most hazardous terrain in the country, right above what is the Autobahn of the Salmon Highway. And so really, I heard from many people, both First Nations and others, who have been part of the construction, and contrary to the stories you might have heard, is they said they have been meticulous in their water crossings. They have been meticulous in terms of the quality of, the sand we use, what we do, how we do it. So really my point is let's get some of those positive stories out. So I'll look forward to sharing in a more comprehensive way the stories that I heard as I traveled the route.
Of course, there was a story just recently about a pipeline crossing of the existing pipeline that may have ruined a salmon bed, though.
So I think what you need to do again is the Trans Mountain did share a number of items in terms of saying this is what happened, this is what it is. And so I think sometimes the media love to pick up one person saying one thing and everyone saying, oh, it's terrible, but they don't go into the more in-depth look. And so I looked at what the Trans Mountain said, but I also talked to the people along the route, and again, the meticulousness, like the First Nations, when it went through Jasper Park, Simp First Nations was there watching every step of the way, every crossing that was done. So they monitored, it was Twin back in 2007, they monitored everything that was happening at that time, and of course that's part of their traditional territory. A lot of the First Nations on the pipeline route have asked for that within their benefit agreements. Whispering Pine says, we are going to be very instrumental in watching what they do, watching how it crosses. So I think those are stories that no one is hearing.
Ms. Blaney, from what you heard, is the majority of First Nations behind this?
Well, you know what, that's definitely not the story that I'm hearing, and I appreciate that there's diverse opinions. There always is, and that's part of what it is to be a human being, regardless of if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. But the reality on the ground is a lot of people are showing substantive concern. They want to see our economy changing to a more green economy. They want to see meaningful action moving us in that direction. And when we see, you know, so many Indigenous communities across Canada that have multiple serious life-threatening challenges, to have this government step up and buy this pipeline for billions of dollars without any sort of discussion with anyone, it just shows when it comes to priorities, Indigenous communities are not the priority. So, you know, I think we have to look at those discussions. They're important ones that need to happen, but at the same time, there's huge impact. And when you look at the ability for the Ocean Protection Plan to actually be implemented in the communities that I represent, if there was ever a spill, it could decimate a huge part of our economy as well. So these are big, complex conversations.
Of course, if it doesn't go by pipeline, it'll go some other way, which is rail right now. We've heard reports that the NDP in Alberta, Rachel Notley's government, would like to buy more thousands of tanker cars. Doesn't that create a bigger risk, though?
Well, it depends on what you're transporting, and right now what we're talking about is bitumen. And if you put it in a pipe and you're putting gases to make that flow faster, it's not that concrete, hard stuff that, you know, if you go by rail, it's a lot safer, actually. So I think, you know, these are complex questions, but the other reality is, when are we going to see that time come that we're actually seeing investment in a greener economy? This is something that could bring a major amount of jobs to our communities. It really looks at dealing with the environment, and it can allow Canada to be a leader internationally. So when are we going to see that action happen as well? And we can't leave the workers behind, and we can't leave the communities behind. We must consult with everyone. That is one of the biggest challenges, but it must be done.
Mr. Miller, the Conservatives, of course, are setting this up to be an election issue. Do you think you can get something built before the start of the election in October?
Well, certainly I trust the work that's done in the media and the exceptional work you do in reporting on these issues, and I don't purport to question them, but we do know what's going on the ground, and we do trust the people on the ground to report back to us. That when you talk about the work that the National Energy Board does, it is very thorough work, but the court said this information that was relayed back to us at Cabinet wasn't sufficient in order to take the decision that was taken. So in order to remedy that, and conscious of the fact that in order to get our resources to markets and diversify our markets, something the previous government failed to do, we need to do so in a way that's respectful of the government, respectful of the environment, respectful of Indigenous peoples and their input in the process. With that in mind, as you've seen, we put 8 teams on the ground through the National Energy Board under the leadership of former Supreme Court Justice Frank Iacobucci. And the minister himself has gone to visit a number of these Indigenous communities. That report is scheduled to come back late February. But we know that this is a challenge, and the process of consultation is an involving matter of law, and it will be tested along the road to reconciliation. This is something that the government needs to be extremely aware of when it starts to take these decisions that are in the national interest. But we also need to trust the institutions that we put in place in order to do that consultation and ensure, as the court said in a judgment that we respect, that we need to do it in a way that isn't simply note-taking, but engaged consultation with communities that are affected. And yes, there's support, and there's also objection. And in all circumstances, we respect communities, groups to protest peacefully. And it is something that we hold very highly as a country, and we need to respect and continue to respect.
Ms. Blaney, I suppose if Trans Mountain goes through, do you expect a much larger version of what we've been seeing up in Wet'suwet'en territory?
Well, I think a lot of people are going to continue to voice their serious concerns. And, you know, the process of consultation is still one that hasn't been done very well. We saw that in the court decision not too long ago, where the courts were very clear. What they saw this government doing was sending note takers out to communities. That's not consultation. That's not a seat at the table. I think until people are heard fulsomely and there's a process in place, which we have not seen happen yet, we're going to continue to see this sort of action, because that's what you do when you're not heard.
Ms. MacLeod, of course, the Conservatives have been pushing resource development of course, it's good for First Nations. Everybody wants to have a job. But is it really a panacea for all that ills First Nations?
Absolutely not, but it's certainly one part of the many First Nations leaderships have identified it themselves as something that's important for their communities. And, you know, as you're aware, there's different groups that would like to have some real skin in this game with equity partnerships. I think that's a tremendous opportunity. You're seeing more and more, at least in British Columbia and perhaps across the country, First Nations saying, you know what, we want to benefit from the opportunities. And for too long, actually, they have been left out of the benefits. So I think, you know, for whether it's through the riding I represent with Trans Mountain, whether it's up north, whether it's Eagle Spirit, you do have a real interest by First Nations and see this as one opportunity for their communities.
Mr. Miller, I'll give you the last word, and in particular, do we yet know what meaningful consultation is? Does the government have a handle on this yet?
Look, this is something that we know is a challenge. We know it's a challenge, but it is also a deep undertaking of this government to get right. The job of anyone at this table, on this panel, is to keep Canadians safe, regardless of the issue. So when we see these heated confrontations, we have to keep that at the top of our minds. Reconciliation, as Senator Sinclair said it best, is something that will be messy, but it is something that will take an extremely long amount of time, and we'll probably go past this government in order to get it properly done. So when we talk about the specific issue of consultation, there is an evolving body of law. We know what we need to get done, and that will be tested time and time again when we get into these heated issues. We know that there's tension between traditional leadership and elected leadership in some communities, and in some there isn't. And so having that sensitivity, making sure we have people on the ground, making sure there's continued dialogue, and that is the key element, to have continued dialogue. It's when the dialogue breaks down that things happen. You start having people digging trenches and making big, regrettable mistakes that we will regret as a country for a long time to come. So ensuring that communication continues and that there are accommodations made is key, because we know that safety is our number one concern as elected officials.
Well, it's great to have everybody back. We're down to the race to the election, I guess. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After the break, the president of the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami gives his opinion at a committee looking at a proposed National Indigenous Peoples Day. That's our show for tonight. By next week, a Liberal promise to introduce child welfare reform legislation should have happened, along with an Indigenous Languages Act. Two major pieces of legislation that are expected by the end of this month. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm going to take this opportunity to say happy birthday to a special someone. Lordy, lordy, someone's, well, I'll say no more, except this. Ihigugmakweka, Akongasawa. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.